The US is the largest producer of geothermal electricity in the world. But if you want to maximize the decarbonization of your grid, it's more efficient to use high quality geothermal for your heating and cooling load than to generate electricity. But doing the geothermal anywhere allows you to create your power where you need it and eliminate the transmission distance. Because I think that's a win-win for everybody to develop these resources, particularly in rural, remote areas.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Geothermal Unleashed, where we're going to explore the cutting edge of geothermal energy. I'm Elizabeth Cambry from Valorec New Energy's team, and I'm here to help educate and document geothermal's rise in the global energy transition.
Well, I would like to introduce our guest for today, Ken Wisian, who's the Associate Director of the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas in Austin. And Ken, you have a fascinating background, and I'd like to dive right into talking about how you have gone from being a major in the United States Air Force to working at the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with y'all today. I'm really excited about this podcast. So yeah, I've had admittedly an unusual career path, and it was Major General in the Air Force. That's about 6 ranks above Major.
Super impressive.
So yes, I did my undergraduate work here at the University of Texas in physics, paid for by the Air Force. They ended up paying for all my bachelor's, 1.5 masters, and a little bit of my PhD over the various years. So I've gone back and forth between military duty and science, just back and forth. I was fortunate enough to be able to do that repeatedly while I worked on my Air Force career. And even in the Air Force, though, I was always doing leading edge stuff. So besides flying a variety of aircraft, I went through the test pilot school at the Air Force, did R&D work on brand new systems, on leading edge technology, that kind of thing. I commanded a drone unit when they were still fairly new in the military, that kind of stuff. And that's always fed back both directions, that searching for what's the next new thing, being fascinated with the leading edge of technology and such, has worked well in both my military and my science careers. And I was fortunate enough to have the flexibility between full-time and part-time military work at different stages of my career that allowed me to go back to graduate school, do my PhD and postdoc full-time while flying part-time for the National Guard and Reserve, and then going back to full-time for the military, finishing out my career, retiring as a 2-star general, and then managing to kind of weasel my way back into the academic world, which was not terribly easy at that point in your stage when you had taken about a decade off from publishing. But it's been two careers that are mutually beneficial, where finishing your PhD in geophysics really gives you some thinking discipline that paid off, in my case, in the military career. The military career on being results-oriented planning strategy feeds into what I do in science now as an administrator and leading my own research group here at the University of Texas. So it's been an interesting dynamic back and forth. And then the military is, I use the doctor title in the military because that's rare. And sometimes I use my general title in academia because that's rare and people remember that.
I think it's really cool. And it's interesting to me to see how they have reinforced each other, and they've actually allowed you to think in different directions. And I think that one of the things that strikes me is that you went from that to geothermal, and then B, like, how does that really tie to geothermal in the world? I mean, how geothermal's appeal?
Well, I think there's a couple of questions in there. I got interested in geothermal. It was, I was looking to get my PhD and leave full-time on the Air Force side, and narrowed down to a few topics in a few universities to go for, where I was also looking at where could I do my PhD but still be close to a National Guard or Reserve unit so I could keep flying. But also I'd always been interested in the environment, in renewable energy. One of the 3 wars I've been in was basically about oil, and I didn't want to see any more of those type of things. So, you know, I like geothermal energy. It's a very clean energy source. It's got basically almost entirely upside with negligible downside to it. And I also, as a geophysicist, I liked the elegance of the math in heat and fluid flow. They're the same equations with different variables. And that attracted me too, to it. So that's what got me into it. I'd always wanted to be a scientist, always wanted to be in the military, just couldn't do them both too well at the same time. So I focused on one, then the other. And now it's come together again. In geothermal energy, myself and other people really started pushing the Department of Defense to look at geothermal energy seriously a few years ago. And about a year and a half ago, they jumped in with both feet with what I think is the largest single call for geothermal prospects or projects in history, where they called for power plants studies at 6 bases. And that count is now, I think, up to about 10 bases,
Sure.
4 of which are in Texas.
Yeah.
So Texas has the plurality of this DOD interest, as well as, I think, civilian and private projects, but many of those are still in stealth mode, so I don't have a real good count on those. But in this new wave of geothermal anywhere, closed loop, enhanced, whatever you want to call them, I think the military is a great early adopter, and Texas is a great place to do it for a wide variety of reasons that we can get into later.
So can I ask, so when you approached the military and you started talking about geothermal, what were you talking about? What did that look like? And then talk a little bit about, you started to talk about closed loop geothermal, EGS. Can you touch a little bit on what those are and let our listeners know about that?
So first on the military. So there has been a small geothermal office in the Department of Defense for decades. It's the Navy Geothermal Program Office that co-manages 1 or 2 of the fields in Western US underneath one of the Navy bases. But they're a very small office and minimal resources. Myself as a retired general, some other people that work in them, able to kind of just go direct and start. In my case, I tried to circulate a white paper. I don't know how far it penetrated, but I put it into several channels. The big deal is a couple of things. The military has a massive and known systemic vulnerability in depending on civilian power grids.
Mm-hmm.
And most military missions now absolutely have to have electricity.
Yeah.
Pardon me. Yes, everybody has backup generators, but think back to the Texas snowpocalypse a couple of years ago.
Sure.
Doesn't matter how many generators you have if you can't refill them after 3 days because the tanks are frozen. So the bottom line for geothermal, especially the new geothermal anywhere approach, is that if you're in the right general area where there's a reasonable amount of heat, you can drill where you want to and generate your power. So that means to a military commander, and I used to be a base commander, you can drill inside your base, generate your power, distribute it right there, no transmission distance. You can guard your facilities. No one can interrupt your supply line because it runs straight to the center of the earth. Huge winds, base load energy, 24/7.
Sure.
About the only thing that might compete with geothermal would be small modular nuclear reactors.
Mm-hmm.
And the military is looking at those too.
Yeah.
But like I said, the light bulb came on, particularly the Air Force Office of Energy Assurance, which has kind of led this charge within the Department of Defense. So credit to them for that. And now, as we see, multiple bases are at least in feasibility stage study, are completed. So in Texas, we've completed a feasibility study in conjunction with Sage Geosystems out of Houston, one of the startups, for Ellington Field south of Houston. Evor is studying Joint Base San Antonio, and then we're also working with Sage on Fort Bliss, El Paso, and just picked up Corpus Christi Naval Air Station earlier this week.
Well, the one thing that comes to mind too is that even if they're not in perfect condition or location for power generation, they can at least use geothermal heat pumps and ground source geothermal and take a huge load off the grid.
Yes, and in between those two, I would add in a direct use of high temperature. So generating your air conditioning, particularly here in Texas, people forget you generate air conditioning with heat energy.
Sure.
So there's, yes, and that's a good general point, which is actually, a lot of people don't think about this, but if you want to maximize the decarbonization of your grid, it's more efficient to use high quality geothermal for your heating and cooling load than to generate electricity. Because generating electricity, especially off the lower temperature range, is going to be at best 15 to 20% efficient. Whereas generating heat or generating air conditioning is much more efficient. It's well above 50%, can reach like 80% efficiency. So, the attention tends to focus on generating electrons, but I always also say, hey, don't forget about just using the heat directly. Now, Elizabeth, back to your question from a while ago. I believe it was the general concepts that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Okay. So geothermal energy, humans have been using for thousands of years. If you think hot baths, things like that, the Roman baths or whatever. Geothermal electricity has been being produced for over a century. And in fact, the oldest plant in the world, Larderello, Italy, has been running for over 100 years. The oldest plant in the US, the geysers, has been running since 1960. So, there's another data point for you. A well-managed geothermal system has a near indefinite lifetime. That's a big deal economically. All these systems, and basically, essentially all the world's current installed power base of electricity generation for geothermal is what we'd call conventional or hydrothermal geothermal systems. So that involves drilling and tapping into a naturally occurring hot water or steam system in the ground. The US is the largest producer of geothermal electricity in the world with I think it's roughly 3.5 gigawatts.
Yeah.
But our grid is so large, that's only 0.4% of our grid. Other countries generate half their electricity from geothermal, especially the Ring of Fire around the Pacific. Kenya has come on real strong in the last decade or two, generates half their electricity. But the world till now has been all about hydrothermal, these natural systems. But that is very geographically restrictive. Nature only creates these concentrated natural resources in areas that are geologically active. Think volcanic areas, areas where continental plates are colliding or moving past each other. And that's also limited, for instance, in the US, the development to west of the Rockies. What has really sparked what I would call a revolution in the last few years is merging of several lines of technology and social aspects to make it viable now to do what we call geothermal anywhere. It's stretching the anywhere right now, but eventually we can get there. And these are involved closed loop systems, or mostly closed loop systems. They're sometimes called enhanced geothermal, sometimes called advanced geothermal. The naming can be kind of confusing. You really have to pin down someone when they're talking about a specific one. But the bottom line is that instead of going for saturated rocks with water or steam in them that are hot, you're just looking for the hot rock. And in this case, you find hot rock, you drill into it, you create your own fluid flow system with your own fluid to extract the heat. And when you can do that, that opens up much more of the world to potential production. because a lot of the world has hot rocks, just not with the natural hot water systems. And again, if you look at a geothermal map of North America, when you get east of the Rockies, the hottest regions, which I would interpret as the first wave that you would develop with the current technology, extend into Texas, Louisiana, kind of along the Gulf Coast, a little bit up in the north central plains as such. But eventually, as the technology continues to advance, even relatively cold cratonic areas like upstate New York will become viable. Not right now, economically. I mean, yeah, you can do it, but it's prohibitively expensive. But economically viable now are particularly areas in Texas and Louisiana, I think. And that's where, again, the plurality of these new technology projects are brewing up right now.
So how is it? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so, you know, when we look at the next generation geothermal, why should oil and gas professionals and companies with technology, why should they be paying attention to this next generation geothermal, the advanced systems and the enhanced geothermal systems?
Okay, so there's multiple ways to approach that. One is the potential for scale up. As I mentioned, the growth in geothermal, for instance, in the US has been very slow for the past few decades. And the major companies, and it's been a thin profit margin industry also. But this new technology that's coming together, one of the three key legs of this, of making it practical now, is the transfer of oil and gas know-how into the geothermal world. Oil and gas for many decades has had vastly larger research and development budgets than the geothermal world. And the net result of that is the technology employed in the field in oil and gas is anywhere from years to sometimes even decades ahead of the technology being employed in the conventional geothermal world. The net result of that is you can now drill much faster, which means cheaper, and typically close to half the cost of a geothermal power project is the drilling costs. So, you know, this idea of can we drill anywhere we want and engineer a system? Yeah, it's been an idea that people have been working on for many decades, but now it's finally becoming economical because largely that oil and gas technology knowledge coming into the geothermal world. You also have continuing advances in the conversion of heat to electricity, and we can go into that in more detail. But also now you have the various social pressures, whether it's stakeholder, law, whatever, on decarbonizing our energy sources. And this is about as good as it gets in that regard. So back to why should the oil and gas professionals be interested in this? Well, first of all, they already are. The courses we've been involved in on teaching kind of geothermal 101 to practicing professionals are full up. And more places are starting to offer that because the demand signal is strong. Mm-hmm. Also, pretty much all the major energy companies at whatever part of the stream they're in have at least formed a team to watch geothermal, if not getting actively involved. They see that it's diversification. If you want to become an energy company and not just an oil and gas company, that's a major next step. And some of them are explicitly stating that now. Getting on the backside of a cold. So there is that. There is the value of providing clean energy and the various dimensions of that also. So, and, you know, again, it's an easy transfer of the skill set. So it's a natural fit when probably 80% of your knowledge, your equipment, all the supporting aspects, whether it's financing or infrastructure or whatever, when about 80% of everything you do transfers into this area so easily, it just makes sense to do it too. And as a side note, you know, the technology for employing this geothermal anywhere is really being driven by startups right now with a little bit of support from the academic world like me. But the academic world in geothermal is a pretty small niche. But the handful of strong startups that are leading the charge, most of them have at least one energy related company backing them, one of the major companies.
Sure.
So again, it's already woven in there.
That's super exciting. And it sort of leads to the next thought, and that is growth. So where do you see the most growth potential?
The most growth is at least in, I'll say North America first, in this geothermal anywhere, the dry rock, enhanced geothermal systems, advanced geothermal systems category, because it's totally open ground right now. I mean, there's nothing now, so you'll be growing from zero.
That's good.
Whereas hydrothermal or conventional geothermal, it's been estimated in multiple studies, there's still probably 3x undiscovered resource out there for that. So there's still good growth in hydrothermal. I would still be quite happy to invest there. But the scale up potential when you can do it anywhere dwarfs that. And the studies are still catching up with that potential, I think. You've seen various ones over the past decade or two as they start to broaden out what they're looking at as far as total geothermal resource base goes. But it's huge. So we just analyzed, did a deep dive on a county in West Texas called Presidio. It's west of Big Bend National Park, where we looked at the resource base, the temperatures, the geology, and then went all the way into techno-economic modeling of different scenarios of use of the heat. And you could easily produce 10, 20 times more electricity than can be used by 6,000 people in a 10,000 square kilometer county. But as long as you're connected to the grid, you can sell that wherever you need to, or apply it there, do server farms, whatever. Okay, so kind of hold that thought. There's a lot, we're sitting on a lot of heat, particularly again in the coastal region up into East Texas, a little bit into southern Arkansas, those areas. So we're sitting on a lot of heat resource. Now, how fast can we create the power systems? Well, as an example, again, in Texas during the height of the shale frac boom, I believe we were drilling about 15,000 wells a year. Now, a surprisingly robust rule of thumb is on how much energy can you get out of a good geothermal well? A few megawatts. Now, combine, say, 1 megawatt per well with 15,000 wells a year. You can change the energy landscape of the country very quickly as this technology is perfected and come online. Now, you know, there's going to be limits, there's going to be unexpected problems that arise. Right now, the long lead time on creating a geothermal power system is the surface equipment. It's the transformers, which right now have an 18-month backlog, and they come from overseas. In some states, you can also throw in permitting and regulation as holdups to scaling this quickly. Again, that's another reason I can look at the military to lead the charge, because if you're doing this on a military base, some things can happen easier and quicker.
Sure.
But the scale up potential is huge. Could we be providing 10% of the Texas grid in a decade? Yes, we could. Will we? I don't know. We got to get the first proof of concept projects online. But I think once we do, it's going to be off to the races, because the business case, the environmental case, the social case is so strong. That I think we're off to the races. But don't forget, for instance, in Texas, we went from nothing to producing more wind power by far than any other state in the country in a very short time. We can do the same thing and lead the charge for the world in geothermal anywhere.
I've got a question. In Texas, how many geothermal pilot, let's call them plants, wells, are there in place right now?
That's a darn good question, because I don't know. There are private projects brewing that are private. so far that are still not in public mode. The military projects, we know there's 4 of those.
Feasibility, though. They're in the feasibility stage.
They're in the feasibility stage.
Okay.
Sage Geosystems,
Mhm.
who we have worked with in the past, but we are not part of this project, just announced this week that they've signed a contract with San Miguel Co-op, a power producing co-op here in Texas, to do an energy storage system.
Cool.
Which a geothermal based energy storage system, which I think is fantastic. You know, while we've had conventional geothermal for a long time, growing slowly, now interest in the past few years has really spiked on geothermal anywhere. And within that movement, in the last year, maybe, suddenly energy storage has just skyrocketed. It's still gaining momentum, gaining attention, but using largely the same technology, it's easier and quicker to employ an energy storage system than to drill a full baseload energy generation system. And so this might end up being a way to kind of get the awareness up there to show that they work even quicker. So I think I'll refer you to the news releases, and I think they expect to break ground before the end of the year.
Yeah.
And developing this and bringing it online as an energy storage project should not take very long at all. I won't speak for them. And again, I'm not part of that project, but this is low-hanging fruit within the geothermal world. And, you know, if it were up to me, then my grand vision would be doing these kind of storage systems at every wind generator in Texas and converting that massive wind supply that we've got into base load
Sure.
without that massive downside of huge lithium battery banks would bring to do the same thing. So again, it's that scale up factor, the ability to drill, you know, in large areas and do it quickly. Once you've mastered the process, bring the cost down even further. It's pretty exciting. I mean, I've been in geothermal since I did my PhD in the subject in the 90s. And this current time is by more than an order of magnitude the most exciting time in my career in geothermal energy.
Well, so what excites me about what you're saying too is that it's just like a clear segue to next generation. And the way that you're thinking is really strategic and large scale instead of just one-offs.
Yes. You know, we've got to do, and let me back up a little bit. So when I give a layman talk or a public talk, I always show an S-curve of adoption. If you're familiar with those, it's just a technology adoption graph, and it's generalized. And it just goes from kind of a flat line. Then people start being aware of a new technology. There's a burst of interest. It goes way up. The saturation in the market goes way up. And then eventually it levels off. Every technology does that. Cell phone adoption does that, et cetera. Now, for geothermal anywhere, or for geothermal, you have hydrothermal, conventional geothermal, which is near the top of the curve. It's pretty mature. It's still got growth, but it's a mature industry. The geothermal anywhere is right at the inflection point of that curve right now. So it's right at the point where it's getting ready to take off. That's the prototyping stage that we're in now, where the startups I mentioned earlier all have recently or will within the next year probably do their proof of concept test. So the picture on what works at what price point is clarifying very fast right now. A couple of years from now, we're going to have a really solid idea of what it costs to do this wherever you want to do it.
Sure.
And so, you know, the investment risk goes way down, all that follows.
Awesome. So I'm curious about what you're working on these days.
Okay, so I have a research group here, and we're growing. We're hiring postdocs right now because business is booming in the research world. So we've been doing a fair amount of resource assessment work, where we've got multiple things going in that regard. For instance, I talked about that Presidio County in West Texas. This is another theme, by the way, where we're looking to hold a workshop. Well, we are holding a workshop, sorry, at Geothermal Rising 2 days before the main conference, by the way, on rural geothermal development of energy, because I think that's a win-win for everybody to develop these resources, particularly in rural, remote areas. The big cities, they have the resource, they get the love, they get the political attention. These remote areas that are sitting on a lot of heat don't. But the potential to spur economic development in relatively underserved remote communities is huge. So we're getting together workshop to focus on this aspect and bring both the locals together with developers to say, hey, look, there's a marriage waiting to happen here. You two talk to each other. And that includes support all the way up to the White House level on that.
Oh,
So we've been working those levels, resource assessments, techno-economic modeling. We've done a little bit of work in support of Jamie Beard's project Interspace on their worldwide harmonization of geothermal data project. These military-based studies that we're working on. We launched earlier this year an industrial research consortium on geothermal here at the Bureau. So as a way of background, by the way, the Bureau, we're the State Geologic Survey of Texas, but we're mostly a soft money applied research organization. That's like 80% of what we do. And one of our most successful models for many decades has been bringing together industry frenemies to pool their resources and solve common problems. We've been doing that in oil and gas and carbon sequestration and seismicity and other areas for a long time. Our newest one now is called Hot Rock. So that's our Geothermal Research Consortium. We launched it earlier this year in the late in the spring. Our initial membership is Shell, SLB, and Chesapeake Energy, along with the Environmental Defense Fund as an ex officio member. And the Air Force is saying they'd like to join in also. So we're looking to grow that membership. There's plenty of work to do, as is evidenced when we meet with our sponsors and go, okay, what problems do you have? Here's our strengths. Let's cross match them and see what we can focus on for the next couple of years. So that's our newest direction that we're going in. A lot of machine learning applying to big data problems. There is an immense amount of geothermal data out there of highly variable quality. It's a perfect big data problem for machine learning. Sensing, measurement. I mean, there's so much to do, and the academic world for geothermal is so small and has been for so long that, again, we're pretty test saturated right now and trying to grow.
Well, okay, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just to tie in, I mean, so I've done a lot of work in economic development, and one of the challenges in other countries is the rural to urban migration, which we're starting to see now. So you see kind of like ghost land and ghost towns in small rural areas, but then just really, really stressed infrastructure in the urban areas. So what you're talking about really ties into a larger strategic objective, not just for energy security and stability, but also in terms of economic development and economic justice.
You're quite right on that. I think that's what's really, I think, starting to resonate with people. You know, and as we found out during the pandemic, you can do a lot of work from almost anywhere as long as you got power and a good internet connection. Transmission lines are a little difficult to run. They're expensive and they're big investments. But doing the geothermal anywhere allows you to create your power where you need it and eliminate the transmission distance. You need to power a university campus or a new housing development. You can drill right there. You need to power a military base, drill right in the center of it, as long as you're in the right region. So you can solve one of the major problems about developing remote areas that way. And the other thing you need is good internet, and fiber is relatively cheap to lay. So you can really, I think there's something there that we need to develop, investigate and develop more. I'd like to make this more international. We just haven't had the bandwidth yet. We're going to start with what we know and expand outwards. And by the way, we do work around the world, even though Texas is our backyard, but we do geothermal. We have projects in other subject areas also all over the world, just so people know.
Okay, so I want to go back to the consortium. So, and just clarify, is this a super hot rock or is it just a hot rock?
Okay, so that's a good question. Right now, we're looking at fairly near-term stuff. So we're
Okay.
looking at the lower temperature range. We're not looking at super hot. But,
What
you
is
know,
that
as the
temperature range?
Pardon?
Can you
Oh,
tell us?
I'd
Yeah.
say 150 to 200 to maybe 250. Now, if you're talking Texas, you'd have to go really deep to get to super hot. Other areas will probably be super hot before Texas, but there's still plenty of resource at the medium and low temperatures. So that's what we're primarily focused on right now. But we also do conventional hydrothermal work, and we're definitely keeping an eye on the developments that would make super hot, super critical, economically viable. And of course, that is many people's goal. But I don't want to wait to get to that technology before we develop what we can right now. And plus, I think there's a lot to be said for achieving some quick wins just to get the knowledge penetration everywhere. But yeah, if we can get the deeper and hotter you go, the better.
So
no doubt about it.
If we're to look at Texas, I mean, what areas have the super hot rock temperatures?
Everywhere if you go deep enough, but it's prohibitively expensive. The hottest areas in Texas are the East Texas Salt Province, the Gulf Coast, called the whole Gulf Coast sedimentary wedge, and then the far west Texas along the Rio Grande Valley, where you start to get into kind of a basin and range kind of extensional tectonics. And in most of these areas, you would need to drill to roughly 4 to 5 kilometers to get to 150 C. So that gives you kind of a framework to think about. In that Rio Grande, probably less than that because it's looking fairly hot.
It's not all that deep.
It's not all that deep. I mean, it's well within oil and gas drilling range. That Ellington Field project, I think the target was about 4.5 to 5 kilometers and 175 C. And that base happens to sit right between two older oil and gas fields. And so, I mean, good knowledge of the geology. You don't have to drill that deep to get to economically viable temperature. I mean, yeah, the hotter the better, but there's always that trade-off between more expensive to drill deeper versus more reward for the higher temperatures.
Excellent.
Well, that's
we're about out of time for episode today, but it's been a great discussion. And I just wanted to, if you have any concluding remarks to share with us before we wrap up.
Boy, I've been so wrapped up in talking, I haven't thought about that. I'll come back to two things. One, it really is exciting. We are potentially on the cusp of a revolution in energy for the world that, short of solving fusion, is probably our best long-term energy source. I mean, there are multiple studies have estimated that there are several thousand times our current world energy needs in extractable heat energy in the upper 10 kilometers of the crust. That's significant. I mean, it really can solve a major problem. So I would look at that, but at the same time, don't forget it's not all about generating electrons. Heating and cooling is a big deal, especially for things like server farms, where there's starting to be a big draw on the grid. Agricultural uses, generating your air conditioning, especially here in the hot areas, it's a big deal. And we can do an awful lot in very near term if people were just more aware of the potential of this. So watch closely. In another year or two, we'll have multiple prototype projects online that will give people a lot more confidence in what we're talking about here.
Excellent. And thank you so much for joining us today for our first episode of Geothermal Unleashed. And we hope to our listeners that today's discussion has sparked new insights and deepened your understanding of the geothermal industry. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. This is great.